We are standing here in a homeowner's backyard. This is a project that was completed about a year ago to date. And this homeowner came to us, actually live across the creek from him. And he came to me asking if there's anything that he could do for his shoreline, because he he had a bulkhead, which is a vertical structure that was collapsing. It was built in the 1950s. And he went to get his wetlands permit to put in a new one, and he was told that he needed to put in a living shoreline instead. And so he was looking for a contractor to do the design and also the construction. And he called me up and asked if we could help, and we have a cost share program, which we were able to cost share this project 50% of the total project cost. This is a more soft approach, so we used Coir logs and backfilled it with sand. We did a little bit of upper bank grading, but pretty straightforward with the project. And as you can see, it's doing very well. It's only been a year out, and the Spartina is already taller than I am. Elizabeth River project, our staff designed the project and then permitted it, and then we actually ended up coming in and building this particular project.
This project required the completion of a joint permit application, and the joint permit application had a review from the VMRC, the local Wetlands Board, which is Norfolk, and the Corps of Engineers. And it resulted in a permit that was a joint permit from the local Wetlands Board as well as the VMRC for what we call our Expedited Living Shoreline permit, and from the Corps. And it took about a month and a half. This project also required a review of the regulatory agencies for the pier that we're standing on. That was something that was included in the entire joint permit application. It's reviewed separately, but everything can be turned in the same application. And then there were a few trees in the area where you see the grass now, and those trees required a permit from the city in order to remove them. They also had to be mitigated for as a result of removing them.
Materials that we used, since this was a softer approach, we used the 16-inch Coir logs. If you actually look behind you, there's a 16-inch Coir log over there that can be seen. Then we also used jute mesh to lay out on top of everything, tons and tons and tons of sand, and all of these native marsh grasses. Lower marsh grass here, Spartina alterniflora, and then more high variety Spartina patens. First thing we had to do, since there was still old bulkhead material in the lower mud part and the lower mud flat area here, we needed to use a 16-ton excavator to get that material out and then transport it to a dumpster with a skid steer. The dumpster would have been placed on top over there at that time, and then from there we would then install the Coir logs, staking them down with wooden stakes and then tying them down so they won't float off. And then after that we would start the process of unloading tons and tons and tons of sand with the excavator to fill in the area, to bring the sand up to height with the Coir log there, and then lay out jute mesh, because with this shoreline here, because they have a pretty decent slope from the top of the yard down to their bank, we would have a lot of sheet flow with rainfall, so we would need something to help break up that water energy as all the runoff from any kind of large rainstorm would be flowing down, so we wouldn't have any plants popping up and floating off. And then once all this was done, this isn't here now because this is grown in so well, we had goose exclusionary fencing around the perimeter, help prevent geese and ducks from flying in and being able to eat at the immature plants, because at the time we get the plugs at about 1 to 2 inch size, and it takes about a year or two for them to grow to this kind of size. I believe this did take 2 to 3 weeks, mainly because we did have some scares with a hurricane around that time period, and then we also had a couple of rainstorm events, so we needed to touch up on the sand in order to be sure that the project would be an overall success down the road.
The most important thing for homeowners to think about is when their goose fencing is up is maintaining it. So when these fresh plants are babies and they're just plugs, it's really easy for curious waterfowl to get in and pull those up. So making sure that the goose fencing is maintaining itself. We also put string across the top with fluorescent flagging so that they don't use it as a landing zone. So making sure that that's in place, as well as keeping an eye on the rack line that builds up. So when we do get high tide events or flooding events, keeping an eye on the amount of material that floats in and can smother the marsh. So whether that's pine straw, boards, the random things that can float through an urban river, keeping those things in check. Also looking at plugs that might have been popped up if they weren't put in well enough. So a good sporty homeowner can come out and do that themselves. They can also tell a contractor that they've lost plants. They could also tell us. So for a site like this in particular, this homeowner was able to keep a good eye on their plants. Their plants have also grown in really well. These have been in for about a year now. And with that, they were able to go ahead and remove their goose fencing. One of the last things that we want to do is keep goose fencing up for a full 2 years, say, and the plants grow in so well that you actually damage plants when you're trying to remove the fencing. So that's why this came out early. The other thing is, at a site like this where he does have such a significant slope coming down, we planted in jute mesh, as Ian mentioned, but with that, we want to make sure that this bare area behind the patons does get populated. So whether that's patons that grow in as well, whether it's turf grass, making sure that something gets in so that we don't just have that loose sediment available.
Would that bare area be a good place for some conservation landscaping using native plants, creating a little bit more of a buffer between the turf and the living shoreline?
Yes, it would. So a riparian buffer planting is something we suggest to almost all of our homeowners if they have a potential opportunity for a wetland to migrate directly into their property to continue protecting it. So this area is partial shade, has brackish water, so planting with natives that are inclined to be in those situations and in those conditions. You could plant dozens of species in a place like this.
I noticed that some of the plants that are occurring naturally on one side of the property are starting to show up on the other side, naturally regenerate on the other side of the property. Could you talk about that a little bit?
I could. So they have some marsh fleabane, this lovely pink flower on this side, and there's a couple of little ones popping up within the new marsh. This was already here when we came to build the project. It was about the only plant that was existing behind this failing bulkhead. So those came out when the sand was put in and when the core logs were put in, so they are starting to regenerate. Marsh fleabane naturally seeds very well, so that's something that can also fill in around. The other thing is, on either side they have one neighbor that has significant saltbush, and on the other sinusoides. So our hope is that with all of these surrounding natives, they won't have to deal with potential invasive species as well.